Good afternoon and welcome to San Diego Mesa College Recital Hour. For those of you that are new, Recital Hour is a course put on by San Diego Mesa College in which we offer performances to our students as well as the public. Now, we used to do this in person on campus for the students and for an audience alike, but since the pandemic, we have decided to put all these performances online. And this has led us to having not only a greater audience, but a greater talent pool in which to draw from to share with our students and the public. So thank you for coming. If you are interested in Recital Hour, please click the link down below to learn more about it, or send me an email and I'll put it at the bottom of the screen here. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's performer. Now, generally we do this course as concerts, but not always. Sometimes we have special presentations, which is what we have today. Being the first performance for the fall 2021 semester, we wanted to do something special. So we invited David Badagnani, a specialist in ancient Chinese music, to do a presentation for us. So this is going to have some performing, some music, as well as a lot of explanation on a subject you may be unfamiliar with. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and I am sure we are all going to learn a lot together. Thank you so much and enjoy the show.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's my pleasure to share some of my recent work in the field of Chinese music with you today. I'm speaking to you from my home in Kent, in the northeastern corner of Ohio, near the more familiar cities of Cleveland and Akron. Although Ohio's nickname is the heart of it all, it is actually your state of California, dubbed Gumsan, meaning Gold Mountain or Hills of Gold, by the first Chinese immigrants, that represents the true heartland for traditional Chinese music in the U.S., as transplanted here for the first time beginning in 1849. And in fact, San Diego County happens to be home to the most famous U.S.-based Chinese musician of all, the bebop player Wu Man, a founding member of Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble, who lives with her family in Carlsbad. The first ever university Chinese music ensemble in the U.S. was also established not far from you at UCLA in the 1959-1960 academic year by the late Louis Cunyan, whose brother, the great Louis Puiyuan, who will be 90 next year, lives in San Gabriel near Los Angeles. Chinese music, as it exists within mainland China and Taiwan, as well as across the Chinese diaspora, which is often referred to as the Sinosphere, embodies a data set that is so rich and endlessly fascinating that one can spend a lifetime exploring just a single corner of it. Musical traditions are strongly regional, associated with particular geographical areas or language groups. Of China's 33 province-level administrative divisions, each has between 10 and 20 prefectures, and each prefecture may comprise up to 1,000 villages. To give you an idea of the diversity, some musical traditions, including especially rare forms of difang xiqu, or local opera, may continue to be performed in just a single village. Since 2005, some several thousand of these traditions have been acknowledged and supported by China's Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, whose lists at the national, provincial, and municipal levels are a gold mine of information about numerous previously unknown musical traditions, many of which may have been assumed to already have disappeared. Much of my current research focuses on these traditions, which I do my best to disseminate via my YouTube channel, which has more than 700 such videos, as well as the Traditional Chinese Music Facebook group. So that you can get a sense of what I do performance-wise here in the Cleveland area, I'll share with you an excerpt of a performance by my group, the Cleveland Chinese Music Ensemble, which I co-founded in 2008. The piece is Jin She Kuang Wu, or Wild Dance of the Golden Snake, which is one of the top Chinese New Year favorites, and a piece with which we often end our performances. Our instrumentation is small, just 2 winds, 2 strings, and 2 percussion. Not as large as an ensemble might be in California, New York, or even Vancouver or Toronto, where Chinese ensembles might have 50 or more players. The instrument I'm playing is the sheng, a free reed mouth organ with 17 pipes that provides quintal harmony, or chords based on perfect fifths, for each melody note. Not only is Chinese music rich in regional traditions, but also in its historical inheritance of repertory. There are pieces handed down over 5 previous dynasties, the Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing, with scores dating back as early as the 7th century AD. And there are literally tens of thousands of such scores. So it's easy for ensembles today to overlook much or all of this historical repertory because as yet a fully fledged early music movement has not yet emerged in Chinese music. However, there are musicians and groups around the world working on musics from all these historical periods. And just to give you one more example of the type of work that I've done here in Ohio with my group is a performance from a historically focused program from 2017, which we did at Kent State University. And this particular piece is a part of a suite of court pieces. This is court banquet entertainment music of the Qing dynasty, formerly performed at the Chengde Summer Palace of the Qing rulers. And this piece is called Donglai, Winter Comes, and it's actually part of a 4-part suite that starts with spring, then summer, then autumn, then winter. And this is the last movement of that suite. And it was composed in the 18th century when the palace was built. So you could actually consider this an analog to the music being created by Bach, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, often for aristocratic audiences in the same century in Europe. This is the music that was performed in the Palace of China. And thankfully, the musicians of Chengde were able to save their scores from destruction in the Cultural Revolution by hiding them in the walls of their houses. And after everything was okay again in the 1970s, they dug out the scores, and some of them had been destroyed, but a few of them were saved, and this is one of them. And not too many Chinese ensembles outside of Chengde City continue to play this music, which I think is a shame because it's magnificent and very entertaining music. So this will be Donglai, Winter Comes, from the suite of Qing Yin Shi Fan, or banquet music of the Qing dynasty from the Chengde Summer Palace. I hope you enjoyed that. And just so you can see what the notation looks like, I'll now show you the page we just played in Jianpu, which is the standard numerical notation system in use since the 1930s in Chinese music. And it uses numerals to represent the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti of the scale, and beams very similar to in staff notation underneath the numerals to indicate the rhythms. In October of 2018, I received the surprise of a lifetime. I was contacted by Dr. Jenny Zhang, a professor of Chinese language and culture at Marietta College in southeastern Ohio, who informed me that she would be bringing a group of students on a field trip to Cleveland in November in order that they might explore the history of Cleveland's Chinatown community, the oldest in Ohio, which was established in the 1870s. She asked if my Chinese music ensemble would be willing to give a demonstration for her students, and I agreed. And then she mentioned that as part of their visit, they would be taking a tour of the former headquarters of the Cleveland chapter of the Onleong Chinese Merchants Association, located in the upstairs space of the historic 1930 Rockwell Avenue Chinatown building above the Emperor's Palace restaurant. As the inner sanctum for the leaders of Cleveland's Chinese community, I had never before been invited to visit, as it was generally off limits to outsiders. They have a collection of antique musical instruments, she told me, which piqued my interest. Then she shared this photo, which she had taken on a previous tour. I immediately recognized these as instruments associated with Cantonese opera, originating in southern China, but of a type that became largely obsolete in the 1930s as newer instruments were adopted. The huqians, or vertical fiddles, were of particular interest to me, as they were ones I had only seen in photographs and historic films, and no longer available or generally used, even in Guangdong province or Hong Kong, where this music originated. I was very excited at the possibility of examining these instruments, which I was finally able to do in November of 2018. Here are some photos taken by Chinese martial arts expert Mark Lee Pringle, who accompanied me on that day. As a person who had studied Chinese music for nearly 3 decades, it was a thrill to see this cache of several dozen archaic instruments, which had likely not been used for at least 70 years, yet had been so lovingly preserved as if in suspended animation. I should mention that most such instruments are kept in the collections of museums and historical societies and are consequently not available for musicians to play. Through interpreter Minxian Mia Hong, I conveyed to Mr. Huang Xiaojia, an entrepreneur and native of Zhongshan, Guangdong, who had owned the Chinatown building for the previous decade, my interest in possibly returning to document these instruments and possibly also to restore some of them to playing condition, in order that contemporary audiences might hear the sound of the music that was so beloved of Cleveland's earliest Chinese settlers. He agreed, and the project came to fruition with a series of concerts in 2019 and early 2020. After viewing the instruments, the first question that occurred to me was, who were the musicians who had played these instruments, and what happened to them? Having been playing Chinese music in Ohio since the 1990s, I had been unaware that a tradition of Chinese music, other than lion dance drumming, had existed in Cleveland's historic Chinatown community, Cleveland not being a large enough city to support a Chinese opera house, as for example San Francisco or New York City had. No one seemed to remember the musicians, though I was told that they may have left Cleveland and resettled in San Francisco sometime after the 1920s. Then my friend Mark Lee Pringle, the director of the Coiling Dragon Chinese Kung Fu Studio in Girard, Ohio, recommended that I get a hold of Alan Dutka's 2014 book, Asia Town Cleveland, From Tong Wars to Dim Sum. I promptly ordered a copy, read it, and got another surprise. Included in the book were several photos showing the same instruments I had just seen in action between 1913 and 1960. Today, Greater Cleveland's Chinese population is very diverse, with community members originating from nearly every province of mainland China, as well as Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. But as I learned, the first Chinese to make Cleveland their home came from just one small corner of southern China, the Pearl River Delta of Guangdong Province. Although technically all Cantonese and speaking related dialects, the first Chinese settlers came from three distinct areas. The majority of them were laborers from villages in rural Toisan. A smaller number were from Zhongshan just to the east and were mainly farmers, and people from Zhongshan formed the majority of the first Chinese to settle in Cleveland. And finally, a few came from the Guangzhou metropolitan area a few miles to the north and made their living as merchants and entrepreneurs. Hong Kong and Macau, both visible on the following maps, were both European colonies at this time. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the preferred form of mass entertainment for Cantonese people anywhere in the world was Cantonese opera, a variety of folk opera from the Pearl River Delta, which had common roots with Beijing opera, and whose accompaniment consisted of penetrating high-pitched string and wind instruments and thunderous percussion. Here is an illustration from an issue of Harper's Weekly showing the spectacle of Cantonese opera, featuring elaborate costumes and acrobatics, as well as singing and dance, as performed in a theater in San Francisco in 1883. The history of this art form in California is covered by Ronald Riddle in his 1983 book, Flying Dragons, Flowing Streams. Here's a short audio excerpt showing how Cantonese opera sounded in the early 20th century from an Edison cylinder recorded in San Francisco in 1902. The tonal center was high G, which was lowered to C sometime in the 1920s due to changing tastes and the difficulty of singing in the former key.
Number 5, Edison Record.
From Alan Dutka's wonderful book, I learned that the first Chinese settlers arrived in Cleveland in 1870, 1 year after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, the western portion of which had been completed thanks to the Herculean efforts of 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese laborers. As you can see on the following map, Cleveland is located midway between Chicago and New York City, and was at that time an up-and-coming city in terms of population growth and industrial and financial prominence. So it made sense that at least a handful of Chinese immigrants, now out of work, might see opportunity there. I also learned that over the following half a century, they built a thriving and prosperous community whose business leaders remained loyal supporters of the Republic of China, whose first democratic leader, Sun Yat-sen, was himself a native of Zhongshan and actually visited Cleveland in early 1911 to raise money for his revolution against the hated Qing dynasty, which came to fruition in October of that year. The community was not, however, free from internal conflict. The famous Tong Wars did extend to Cleveland, leading to some bloodshed, or racial injustice perpetrated by local officials. These settlers called their new home Kaesing in Cantonese, meaning City of Enterprise, and clustered on a block of Ontario Street between St. Clair and Lakeside Avenues, just north of Public Square in downtown Cleveland. The number of Chinese in Cleveland was small at first. The 1880 census records just 23 East Asian inhabitants. The following archival photos provide a window into the cultural context of Cleveland's early Chinese community, showing the use of musical instruments in ceremonial and festive activities. You'll also see photos of the Anliang Chinese Merchants Association's beautiful and sumptuously decorated 1930 building, in whose upstairs temple/meeting room the instrument collection is still housed. Because Cleveland's Chinese community had only around 300 members by the 1930s, it was never able to support a Chinese opera theater. But as in the Australian film clips you saw earlier, opera tunes were nevertheless performed in an instrumental fashion, and opera troupes visited from other cities for special events such as national Anliang conventions. Based on the photographic evidence from the CSU and CPL collections, by the 1940s, the younger members of Cleveland's Chinese community had taken up Western instruments, which they probably learned to play in school. And by the 1950s and 1960s, most of the traditional instruments, with the exception of the percussion, were probably no longer used, except for use as props in posed photos like these. Take special note of the sona a young woman is pretending to blow in the photo taken in 1955. Amazingly, of the 42 sona reeds found in the Anliang collection, photographer Jim Francis was able to get a close-up shot showing traces of what appears to be pink lipstick on just one of them, thus possibly identifying this reed as the very one used for this photo. In the first decades of the 20th century, the instruments used by Cantonese immigrants in neighboring cities, as well as anywhere and everywhere else in North America they had settled, were virtually the same, as can be seen from this photo taken in Pittsburgh's Chinatown in 1912. As I mentioned earlier, I learned of the existence of Cleveland's historical Chinese musical instrument collection in October of 2018 and had an opportunity to examine them for the first time the following month. After having received permission to do so, I began researching and documenting these instruments in June 2019, finally completing that documentation just last month in August 2021. I spent the entire day with the photographer-videographer, Mr. Jim Francis of Stowe, Ohio, photographing each of the 41 instruments, then demonstrating each one in video form. This unprecedented opportunity allowed me to create these demonstrations just for you at Mesa College. Now I'm going to run straight through every instrument in the collection and what it sounds like with these video demonstrations. This runs about 21 minutes. This is the old-style, short-necked Cantonese yi-yin, or arxian in Mandarin, meaning two-stringed instrument. It has very thick silk strings, and the tuning is la-mi, or in this case A-E for C-diao. And I'll demonstrate the range. This is the old-style Cantonese zhuk tai kam, or in Mandarin, zhu ti qin, meaning bamboo fiddle. And the strings are tuned to mi, la, or e, a in the key of si diao. And I'll demonstrate the range. This instrument is called the qin qin, or the mei hua qin. Mei hua meaning plum blossom, named for the octagonal shape of the sound box, which resembles a plum blossom. And this is a long-necked, fretted plucked lute with 3 strings, formerly 2 strings, modern times has 3. And the fretting system is very interesting, but the instrument in the collection of the Anlong Chinese Merchants Association of Cleveland that's been handed down, unfortunately is missing its bridge, has a cracked soundboard, and missing most of its frets. So I brought a comparable instrument, a qin qin, from the collection of the Cleveland Chinese Music Ensemble. This is being borrowed from Dr. Sarah Miller of Kent State University. And this one is strung with 3 silk strings, which are currently tuned to C, G, and C. And this instrument performs a supporting role in the Cantonese opera ensemble. And the fretting is worth describing. It has 7 equally spaced frets per octave. That means there's no half steps, and all the intervals are of equal size. So each whole step is 171.4 cents, as compared to the 12-tone equal tempered whole steps, which are 200 cents. So they're slightly smaller, and this allows you to modulate the same melody into 7 different tonal centers, and it sounds the same. For example, demonstrate the range. Here's how a piece sounds on this instrument. Here's how a piece sounds on this instrument. is called the Xiao Sanxian, the small three-stringed lute. It's fretless and has snakeskin covering both sides of the resonator. As you may be able to see, the snakeskin is broken on both sides of this particular instrument, but you can see that the thickness of the body is quite thick wood, and only a few inches of it is exposed. And this part is wood directly under the snakeskin. So on the playing side, if the bridge is placed on the wood, so about here, there's no sound from the string when you pluck it. But if we slide the string onto the exposed surface of the snakeskin, immediately you hear the snakeskin amplifying the sound of the string. And this instrument is valued for its very percussive texture, which cuts through it and sounds almost like a small drum. And I'm afraid that that's all the sound that this instrument, which is in damaged condition, can produce. But it only has two of its three strings remaining. But at least you got a sense of what this Sanxian used in Cantonese opera looks like. And it also has a bone capo, which is able to be moved up and down, and that will change the whole tonal center of the instrument without retuning the pegs. So that's the capo that's right here. This instrument is called the yuenkam, or yueqin in Mandarin, meaning moon lute. And it was formerly a very popular instrument in Chinese folk music, including Cantonese music, especially in the 19th century through the early 20th century. The yueqin in the collection of the Anlang Chinese Merchants Association is no longer part of the collection, although it can be seen in photos dating from the 1920s through the 1950s. So it may have walked off with one of the organization's members since that time. So that you can hear it, the sound of the instrument, I brought mine from home, and this yueqin is a little bit different in that the fretting is 12 frets per octave rather than the more traditional 7 frets per octave. And I have it strung in the 19th century manner of double courses, tuned to a perfect fifth. So this particular one is tuned D-D-A-A, like the middle 4 strings of a mandolin. And here's what it sounds like. Cantonese small gong. another Cantonese small gong. A third Cantonese small gong. Xiaoluo, small gong, made of brass. Xiaoluo number 2, made of brass. Medium cymbals. Big cymbals. Both of the old-fashioned Cantonese opera drums called dagu in the Anlong Association's collection have their heads torn, and the sound should be like a very high woodblock, but it is no longer. This old-style Cantonese opera drum, like the previously shown dagu, is very heavy, carved from an entire log of a tree, hollowed out, and with only a very small surface of skin being exposed. This one has the head torn again, so the sound will be what it should be, which should be like a very penetrating high woodblock. In Chinese opera ensembles, including Cantonese opera, a single-headed, small, high-pitched drum is often used by the conductor of the ensemble. And as you can see, it has a very smooth head, and consequently this instrument was called Heshantou, the monk's head, like the shaved head of a Buddhist monk. And if you look underneath, you can see that it has a single head on the top and no head on the bottom, and only a very small, let's say about 2-inch diameter portion of the skin is exposed. So it takes a lot of skill to produce the tone on this instrument, which really amounts to something very similar to a woodblock sound. In the left hand, the paiban, 3 pieces of wood that you collect together as a clapper, played by the left hand of the conductor in the opera ensemble. So it might sound like this. Maybe formerly called mantogu, which refers to a bun or a piece of bread. And the sound is produced almost like a rim shot, and you use your knee to align the angle of your stick, so it produces a cracking sound that cuts through the whole ensemble. That's why this instrument is the leading instrument, keeps all the other instruments together. In modern Cantonese opera, they just use a woodblock instead, because the technique of playing this is quite difficult. This lion dance big drum is a more recent addition to the Anlong Chinese Merchants Association instrumentarium of the head bearing the date 2003, and it was formerly used by the lion dance team, which performed notably at the game of the Cleveland Cavaliers basketball team. Underneath is on the bottom, it's open, there's no head on the bottom, and there are these metal springs, steel springs, all inside the inner wall of the drum, which supposedly serve to resonate the sound. And this is the sound of the drum. This instrument is called the gaobianluo, or the high edge gong, and it seems to be made out of very heavy bronze with a very wide lip, and is an essential percussive instrument in the Cantonese opera ensemble, and the sound is very, very strong. This instrument is seen in many historic photos of the Cleveland chapter of the Onleong Chinese Merchants Association, and it is a maluo, or horse gong. This particular one has a big crack in it, so it's damaged, but we can at least get a sound of it by playing it softly. Well, that covers the instruments in the collection of the Onleong Chinese Merchants Association of Cleveland. But you may be wondering, well, what do they sound like together in an ensemble or accompanying Cantonese opera on the stage? Well, unfortunately, there are not many examples of this on film. Around the 1930s, Cantonese musicians switched to a whole new set of instruments that were different from the ones preserved in the Cleveland collection. And not too many people prior to the 30s appear to have thought to document this on film, although there are many photographs and written accounts. Those written accounts, written by non-Chinese writers, not always speaking of the music in very favorable terms. But interestingly, two short clips, which are of very high historical value, do exist, and they were both filmed, interestingly, among the Chinese community of Melbourne, Australia. And so I'm going to share with you those rare clips now, and you'll see that the instruments in use in the films are exactly the same ones preserved in Cleveland, and which would have been used by Cantonese people wherever they were living in the world, whether in Guangdong province, in Southeast Asia, Australia, Canada, the United States, Europe, South America, or even the Caribbean. So these clips are very rare and also show the exciting nature of this music, almost raucous in a way. The percussion and the sona, or sham, is quite loud and piercing, and this music was truly a mass entertainment, which was popular among all the social classes and included a lot of martial arts, dance, singing, and historical sagas, which were educational as well as entertaining. These two clips feature instrumental music without singing, so that probably indicates that there were no opera troupes in the area where this was filmed, so they just did an instrumental version of it, and that's exactly what was the case in Cleveland, which is a small community, whereas San Francisco and New York both had opera troupes, and Chicago has a troupe, but they perform unstaged operas with singing but without the costumes and acting. The first of these clips was filmed at New Year's Eve on December 31st, 1934 in Melbourne, Australia, and the second was filmed example of the Melbourne Chinese Orchestra in 1931. And hope you enjoy them. Although scores are almost never used in actual performance by traditional Chinese musicians, they are, however, used as a reference or memory aid, since no one can remember every melody by heart, some local traditions having a repertory of up to 3,000 tunes. And local ensembles usually keep books of scores, which are often in gongcha notation, which uses Chinese characters to represent the pitches, and was commonly used prior to the adoption of number notation in the 1930s. So that you can see the kind of gongcha scores that would have been used by Cantonese musicians in the early 20th century, including those in Cleveland, I'll show you a score for Xianhua Diao, or Fairy Flowers tune, which is the Cantonese version of the famous Molihua, or Jasmine, which was shared with me by John Clifford. From low sol to high do, the syllables are he se yi shang che gong fan liu wu yi shang. In the process of restoring the Onlong instruments to playing condition, I received invaluable assistance from John Clifford, a specialist in old-style Cantonese opera, who provided advice regarding repertoire selection, string gauges, tuning, bridges, and much else, as well as Carol Chong of Sound of Asia Musical Instruments in Hacienda Heights, California, who provided high-quality, heavy-gauge silk strings with which I was able to restring the bowed and plucked string instruments. Finally, I'll share with you a montage of images and video clips of the performances in which the Cleveland Chinese Music Ensemble was allowed the opportunity to use some of these historic instruments in an effort to recreate the sound of the music of Cleveland's historic Chinatown community. These were multimedia historical performances with narration, celebrating the 150th anniversary of that community's establishment in 1870, which we presented at 7 different venues between August 2019 and February 2020. It was a special honor that Mr. Huang, Ms. Hung, and a delegation of senior members of the Onleong Chinese Merchants Association and Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association attended several of these performances, with a group of Onleong leaders driving in all the way from Chicago for the one that took place at the Rockwell Avenue Chinatown. Just one note about instrumentation. Since we didn't have enough players, all the instruments couldn't be played simultaneously, such as the high and low hard bow fiddles. So for some pieces, we switched instruments between pieces or within the same piece so the audience could hear more of them. In one of the videos, you'll see Mark Lee Pringle, who was the narrator for our performances, doing a martial arts mashup of the Monkey King Sun Wukong and Drunken Kung Fu, along with our playing. I hope you enjoy it.